The new Larceny Barrel Proof. Is this the poor man's pappy we've been waiting for? Let's find out on the Mash and Drum. The story of Larceny Bourbon and John E. Fitzgerald is full of mystery and a bit of intrigue as well. It was said that in 1870, John E. Fitzgerald whiskey was a product named after a distiller working at Old Judge Distillery on Benson Creek, which was outside of Frankfort, Kentucky. Now, his whiskey and how good it was started gaining popularity, but you couldn't get it. It was sold exclusively to private clubs, rail and steamship lines before renaming and trademarking it to Old Fitzgerald in 1884. Now, this story lived on through the one and only Solomon Charles, or S.C. Herbst, a spirits distiller and distributor with businesses in Kentucky and Wisconsin, who actually owned the Old Fitz brand from the 1880s all the way through Prohibition. Now, the intrigue comes into play is that as time went on, we come to find out that the story of John E. Fitzgerald making all this incredible whiskey on the banks of the Kentucky River is completely made up. In fact, the man himself, Pappy Van Winkle, purchased the Old Fitzgerald brand during Prohibition and made it his own signature label. Now, Pappy moved production of Old Fitz to his distillery, where it became the first great wheated bourbon and eventually one of the most famous bourbon brands in the world, by substituting the rye grain in a bourbon and replacing it with winter wheat for a softer, more well-rounded and fruitier flavor profile like those found in Weller and Maker's Mark. So that begs the question, who the hell was John E. Fitzgerald? Revealed by Pappy's granddaughter, Sally Van Winkle Campbell, in her 1999 book, But Always Find Bourbon, in fact, John E. Fitzgerald was not a famous distiller at all. He was a bonded treasury agent who, at the time, were the only people legally allowed to carry the keys to barrel-stored rickhouses. So the real Mr. Fitzgerald apparently had a particularly discerning palate for good bourbon and would use his rickhouse keys to gain access to the best barrels, which eventually became known around the distillery as the Fitzgerald barrels. So in reality, S.C. Herbst and then Pappy immortalized the man who had both the keys and the fine taste by naming the brand Old Fitzgerald. So Mr. Fitzgerald wasn't a distiller, didn't have a stake in a distillery, never really made whiskey at all. He was basically a highfalutin security guard with an awesome palate and a set of keys. Today, Larceny Kentucky Straight Bourbon honors both the superb taste of this treasury agent and the legacy of the Old Fitzgerald brand, which is why on the bottle there are keys and the can't miss big keyhole right there on the front of the bottle. The original 92 proof Larceny brand was launched in September 2012 as an affordable wheated bourbon that was part of the Old Fitzgerald family. Now, building on the popularity of wheated bourbons in general and the market's affinity for barrel proof offerings, Heaven Hill has released Larceny Barrel Proof. So this is similar to the strategy Heaven Hill utilizes with their Elijah Craig Barrel Proof line of multiple releases in a year. Larceny Barrel Proof will be released on an allocated basis 3 times a year, January, May, and September. Each release will have different proofs and consists of wheated bourbon aged about 6 to 8 years old. So this is the first release of the new line for January 2020, or on the bottles, the A120 batch. This comes in 123.2 proof. It's non-age stated, as I mentioned. It's supposed to be batched with bourbons that are about 6 to 8 years old. It has a mash bill of 68% corn, 20% wheat, and 12% malted barley, and retails for around $50. All right, guys, pretty excited to try this one. This is about my 4th or 5th pour of this one. This was pretty high up in the neck when I first got it. So when I first tried it, there wasn't a lot of wheated bourbon characteristics there, except for the intense sweetness. But let's see if it's changed at all since it's gotten past the shoulder. So here we go. Let's go to the nose. The first thing that came to mind when I smelled this was Cracker Jacks drizzled in chocolate. It's the best way I could describe it. There's a lot of brown sugars, hint of molasses. Yeah, I mean, I can't get past it. It's really a fresh box of Cracker Jacks, and if you drizzled some milk chocolate syrup on them and just ate that, that's literally what it smells like in the glass. There's that signature Heaven Hill, almost smoked peanut characteristic. There's a lot of barrel char I'm getting in here, a lot of barrel influence. I will say the one difference that I've picked up since it's opened up a little bit has been I'm getting a slight apple note. Maybe a little bit of fruit characteristic is coming out, but it's not the fruitiness that you would find in a typical wheated bourbon. This is definitely staying on the darker side. The Heaven Hill profile, I feel like, is taking over this glass way more with that oak and the peanut and the Cracker Jack and the chocolate more than anything. But it is intensely sweet. It's just not fruity sweetness. This is more dark and candy sweet. All right, let's go for a sip. Here we go. Cheers. On the palate, I will say at first sip, the first time I ever took a sip of this, I was really impressed with the mouthfeel of this one. It really coats the palate really nicely. That barrel proof aspect to it really paints the inside of the mouth. A lot of caramel and vanilla up front. Brown butters. Or brown butter. Brown butters. It's not more than one brown butter. Just one brown butter. Brown butter. Peanut. More of that Cracker Jack. This is one where the nose is matching the palate a little bit. Not getting a ton of complexity here, but just really good, solid, sweet flavors. Let's go for another sip. Yeah, it's so candy sweet. The butterscotch aspect of it is trying to come forward a little bit more, which I like. It's kind of fighting that Cracker Jack note that I was getting on the nose. You're still getting the Cracker Jack and chocolate, but the chocolate is now has gone away a little bit more slightly, and there's more of a nice butterscotch note coming in with the caramels, the vanillas. Still getting that hint of chocolate. There's really not a lot of fruit to this that I'm getting. I mean, slightly, but not getting a lot of fruits in here. It's just staying, that Heaven Hill profile is just really overtaking the palate on this one. Let's go for another sip. Yeah. When it comes to the finish now, it's medium. I wouldn't say it's long. It drinks a lot easier than I thought it would once you take a couple sips, which is really nice. It stays really sweet. A little more chocolate in that finish. That oak profile is really, it's strong on this bourbon, way more strong than I thought it would be. I don't know, you think wheated bourbon, you just think the oak will be a little bit lighter, not quite as intense as the fruit flavors, especially for something about 6 to 8 years old. But this one, there's a lot of oak influence on here for a 6 to 8 year old bourbon. Yeah, I mean, I would be a little bit scared and I'm hoping it doesn't get a little bit bitter as it gets more air into it, because sometimes that could happen with something from Heaven Hill that's a little bit more on the oaky side. But personally, I don't think that's going to happen. It's so sweet. Let's go for one last sip. So that sip was more, now it's just becoming that caramel corn. The Cracker Jack, the Cracker Jack profile just keeps getting more intense. Chocolate, sweet, caramels, vanillas, brown sugars, maybe more of a brown butter, a little bit of a butterscotch note right on the finish. It's really the same experience all the way through. What I will say, it has a really good mouthfeel to it. It definitely coats the palate. It's not overly complex, I don't think, but you are getting a lot of good, really sweet flavors. All right, so let's get into a comparison between Maker's Mark Cask Strength and the Weller Full Proof. So before we do this comparison, though, let me just say this. For anyone hoping that Larceny Barrel Proof will be close to a bottle of Pappy or William LaRue Weller flavor-wise, it's not. It's not nearly as complex as either of those, but let's compare it to the readily available Maker's Mark Cask Strength and the impossible to find Weller Full Proof to see how the flavors differentiate. All right, so I have the Larceny's right here in the middle. And you just heard me say chocolate, Cracker Jacks, peanut, a little bit of honey characteristic is starting to come out. Not a ton of fruit. Let's compare it against the Weller Full Proof here. See, now this Weller Full Proof to me just has more of a caramel and there's a lot more fruit in here than I'm getting in the Larceny, which is more typical of a flavor profile for me than what the Larceny is bringing. This is just a lot of peanut, a lot of chocolate. This is where all the fruity characteristics are coming out for a wheated bourbon. A lot of cherry and a little bit of strawberry there. A little bit of salted caramel. Now, I feel like the sweetness profile is very close to this. It's just a different type of sweetness. Let's try the Maker's here on the nose. So the Maker's is more of a dusty corn type aspect to it. It's more dusty corn. There's a little bit more of a fruit characteristic to this as well, but it's a lot lighter when you compare it to these two. You could really smell the wheat in there too. This particular bottle of Maker's Cask Strength is 111.5 proof. The Weller Full Proof's 114 and the Larceny is 123 and change. So the Makers is the lowest of the three. But when you compare them side by side, they're all vastly different. Let's try the Makers. Wow, it's crazy how much softer the Makers is when you compare it to the other two. It's just so much lighter, easier to sip. Fruity, a lot of apple I'm getting here too. Apple, cherry, a little hint of orange zest there too on the palate. That dusty corn aspect is still there. Good finish, 111.5 proof. You're gonna feel this one a little bit, but it's a lot lighter when you compare it to the other two. Let's go to the Weller Full Proof. Yeah, the Weller Full Proof just has, again, it's way bolder in flavor than the Makers is. A lot richer in flavor. That strawberry, the salted caramel, the vanillas, the fruitiness. There's a slight pecan note there too. A little bit of a cinnamon almond coming into at the very end. Probably the more of the quintessential wheated characteristic you would get from a barrel proof wheated bourbon. Yeah, when you compare them all three together, the Maker's Mark cask strength is the lightest one, probably the easiest one to sip. It's very corn forward, very wheat forward. Good amount of fruit to it, but a little bit lighter, not nearly as mouth coating as these two. The Weller Full Proof is just a different type of sweetness, probably the most balanced out of the three, I think. It's got all the fruit characteristics you love in a good wheated bourbon, but it's got the bold flavors, the classic vanilla, the caramels. This one happens to be a pick, but it's got a really nice salted caramel note to it that balances out the fruit sweetness. Definitely probably the most balanced and more pleasing flavors, or the more typical flavors that you would find in a wheater in this one. The Larceny Barrel Proof is just a different type of sweetness. This one has all those typical Heaven Hill profiles in spades. I mean, the peanut, the caramel, the brown sugar, hint of chocolate. You get a slight hint of apple in there, I think, a little bit, but not much. It really just stays true to those Heaven Hill flavor profiles. So when you compare them all three, I think all three of them bring something different to the table, but all really delicious. All right, let's go to the final breakdown. So let's start with price. Price, as I mentioned, is $50. What's the value? I think the value of this is pretty high. At $50, I think it's perfect, but given it's a barrel-proof wheater and a new release, you'll probably see this upcharged a bit. It's very sweet, not overly complex. I probably wouldn't pay more than $60 for this. I'd rather most likely sip Elijah Craig Barrel Proof over this, but if you really like sweet bourbons, then you will love this. Next up is availability. Now, I think this is a TBD since it just started rolling out. It will be interesting to see how the distribution works based on Heaven Hill's recent launches, like the Heaven Hill Bottle and Bond, the new one, the 7-year, which didn't even make it in Kentucky at launch. Also the new Elijah Craig Small Batch Rye, which I'm hoping to get really soon, but that one has hit a bunch of different states besides Kentucky as well. So we'll see what happens with that. Finally, do I give this a recommend? Yes. I think for $50, this has the potential to be the best available barrel-proof wheater on the market. It's sweet, it's bolder in flavor than Maker's Mark cask strength, and will obviously be more available than Weller Full Proof. All right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this review for the brand new Larceny Barrel Proof A120. Hope you really liked it. Hope you enjoyed the story behind it. That's the old Fitzgerald story is one of my favorites personally. If you liked it, hit the subscribe button below. Please hit that like button. If you haven't yet, find me on Instagram, find me on Twitter. Let me know what you think of this one if you've had it yet, if you agree with my assessment. And as I always say, it is not about the whiskey, it's the people you share it with. So cheers, and I'll see you next time on The Mash and Drum. Take care.